As a woodworker, when I look at pieces of furniture made by large retailers, I always think, I can totally make that. Maybe I could even make it better. Then the challenges start. Miscalculations, material issues, design tweaks, tool limitations, and the constant battle with time. And I realize it's not as easy as it looks. But with each challenge comes the opportunity to learn and improve. So today I'm going to build a desk based off of this West Elm design that my daughter loved. I usually like to design my own pieces, but when I told my daughter to look for inspiration online, she found this one and didn't really want to make too many changes to it. So here we are. First up, I wanted to get the large round legs out of the way, so I prepared some blanks that will create 4-inch diameter dowels. The glue up process for these is fairly straightforward. I had just enough material to turn these into 4-inch rounds, so those outer pieces were a bit narrower, and I shimmed them up off the clamps so they were centered on the middle pieces and sent them off to dry. These ended up being thicker than I needed, so instead of wasting material at the planer, I trimmed off little strips at the bandsaw, and I wasn't aware of this at the time, but these cutoffs are going to come in handy later. Now I can prep the blanks to become dowels by first turning them into octagons. You may recall I had a scary kickback situation on a similar cut a while back. That was for the legs of my daughter's bed, and I realized the kickback happened because I was putting too much downward pressure on the piece as I was finishing the cut. So I was very careful not to push down too hard as I reached the end of the piece, and it was all good. I rough cut them to length at the miter saw and drilled holes in the ends that I'll use to attach them to my table saw lathe, and thought I was going to have to whip out my router to elongate the miter slots on my outfeed table so I can push the jig through. Then I remembered my outfeed table folds out of the way. Crisis averted, and I could install the blank on the jig. I put a scrap underneath it to prevent it from rotating as I drive the bolt in both ends and lock down the knobs on the back support. I've used this jig for like 4 different projects now, and every time that I do, I procrastinate for a couple hours beforehand because I get a little nervous. But once the blade touches the workpiece, my anxiety goes away. Despite how intimidating it looks, the actual cutting process feels smooth and controlled, and it's not nearly as scary as I expect. For the first dowel, I take small little bites by raising the blade by small increments with each pass until I get to my desired diameter. And while the dowel is still in the jig, I sand it smooth. The saw is now set up with the blade at the correct height so I can create the second dowel in just one pass, and it's so satisfying to watch it take shape. When sanding these, I have the dust collection on my saw turned on, so this is a really great setup. These just need a little more hand sanding at my bench, and they are basically done for now. With the most nerve-wracking part out of the way, I moved on to the next scariest portion, making the curved draw fronts. Draw fronts are usually last, but these are the star of the show. Everything will be based around them, so they get done first. And to make them, I'll need a bending form. I considered using a circle cutting jig to round off the corners, but then I remembered I have a 3D printer. So I looked on MakerWorld, which is Bamboo Labs' model platform, and I found a ton of options for corner radius jigs. I found one that I liked, picked the radius I needed, and set it off to print. Oh yeah, and I upgraded to the X1 Carbon. I'll share some more details about this printer later. Obsessed is an understatement. Anyway, I used a flush trim bit at the router table with my newly printed corner jig, and I couldn't believe that I didn't print these sooner. I was always making these jigs out of 1/4-inch MDF and then losing them amongst my scraps. I'm gonna have to find the time to print all of the sizes. This bending form consists of 2 rounded sides connected with splines. I get all the pieces temporarily placed with CA glue, then I'll secure all the parts with screws. The CA glue is basically just acting as a clamp here. When making jigs, I find it's best not to permanently attach your parts because you never know what sort of changes you're going to want to make, and also gives you the opportunity to disassemble them and reuse the parts for something else. Quick update on these Hyper Tough tools. This is my 3rd project using this drill exclusively, and I've not had to charge the battery yet. I love being able to share these low-cost tools with you guys. And with New Year's coming up, I know people are setting out goals for themselves. If starting your building journey is one of those goals, you can get this drill, which includes a battery, for less than the cost of the battery alone on some of my other tools. Achieving your New Year's goals does not have to break the bank. All right, I'll show you guys how I made these cuts so the corners bend in a little bit, but I did a test curve and I just didn't like how tight the curve was, so I printed a larger radius corner jig, this time on my A1. These take about an hour to print, so while my robot was at work, I disassembled the jig and did some test cuts. The secret to getting the curve spacing correct on curves is a website called Blocklayer. It's a bit cluttered with ads, so it seems confusing, but it's pretty simple. First, set the outside radius you desire, then fill out all the rest of the info in this area and click Calculate. Then it will show you exactly how many cuts and at what distance you need to make your cuts to get the radius you need. If you scroll up and click the Diagrams to PDF button, you're able to download a full-scale template that you can print and use to mark on your board. Blocklayer doesn't calculate blade height, so that's something you'll need to test and just mess around with. I set it so the blade is just touching the last ply layer, leaving a very teeny tiny amount of material, and made the cuts. Using the kerf on the crosscut sled, I'm able to easily line the template marks up with the blade. Miter saw with a depth stop is another popular way to do this. But every time I tried to bend the pieces after, they would break. So I sprayed the top with water to soften up the grain, and that solved the problem. All my testing is done, and my robot finished my new larger radius jig, so I cut the plywood corners at the router table again and reassembled the bending form. Well, not all my testing was done. On a scrap, I tried to use math to determine how long the piece needs to be and where to place all the kerf cuts. And as you can see here, I came up a little short. So I ditched the math and just bent tape around the jig, extending it a little bit, and hoped that it would work. I cut a scrap to that size, put a center mark on it, and lined it up with a center line I drew on the jig. My new radius was 2 inches, so I marked lines 2 inches away from the ends and transferred those lines to my scrap. Now I could take the template I printed from Blocklayer and transfer those marks on the scrap as well. With the blade height set up the same as before, I made cuts on all the marked lines at the crosscut sled, sprayed the back with some water, and I like the look of this curve a lot better. I did notice, however, there was an extra cut that was totally not necessary. The template told me to cut 7, but I really only needed 6. Ready to move on to the real deal, I prepared all the draw fronts. At this point, I'm leaving all the parts oversized and marked a center line on all 4 fronts at the same time. I could use one of those fronts to line up with the center line on the bending form and mark a line where the curve is supposed to start, 2 inches from the end of the jig. The rest of the kerf cuts are marked on this board, remembering to leave out that 7th cut, and then the lines are transferred to the rest of the boards. I had just enough of this material to make these 4 pieces. That's why I did so much testing beforehand. I really did not want to mess this up. Figuring out that I needed to spray the veneer with water to prevent cracking was a huge deal. I would attempt to bend it very, very, very slowly, and if I felt any sense of cracking, I would spray again, wait a little bit, and then start to bend it again. Once I knew the board would bend without breaking, it was ready to be glued up. I put packing tape on the form to prevent glue from sticking and began filling the kerfs with glue. I debated for a while whether to use glue or epoxy. I'm still not sure which one would be better, but I decided to go with glue. Anyway, this is not my first time making curved draw fronts, and it's not my first time kerf bending, but this is my first time using kerf bending to make curved draw fronts. The curved draws I made in the past were made from bendy plywood, and I used a double-sided bending form to get them to shape. The only time I've used kerfs for bending, I didn't need to make a form because I screwed the piece directly to the project I was working on. So I was slightly nervous that this wouldn't work. I thought there would be a lot of springback when I took it off the form, but was pleasantly surprised when I took it off and it kept its shape. I did, however, have a problem where the first and last kerfs were not completely closed and glue was just seeping out of them, and I kept having to refill it. So for the next one, I made this little filler stick that will plug up most of the kerf, and I won't have to keep topping it off with more glue. At least that was the plan. Same as before, fill all the kerfs with glue, except this time I put the filler strips in the first and last kerfs on both sides, and I clamped it all up the same way, making sure everything was lined up using the center lines. As I clamp it closed, you can see all the glue is just pouring out the sides. If I just left it like that, all the glue would seep out. So I got a little smarter on this one, and I used packing tape to create a dam that keeps the glue in the kerfs. You can see it's pooling up a little at the ends, but it's not hemorrhaging like it did on the first one. Also, once I got the last clamp in place, I could remove those center clamps, reach in and clean up as much glue squeeze out as possible. Taking off the tape was like unwrapping a present. The filler strips and tape seemed to work really well. The only other thing that I learned to do on the next one was not to fill the strips with glue all the way. Like, the glue is going to want to run towards the ends anyway, so I stayed away from the ends by about an inch or so, and I think this helped reduce the run out a little bit, especially in combination with the packing tape. I considered making 4 bending forms and doing these all at once, but I'm glad I took it one at a time so I could learn from each one. I know what you're thinking. Yeah, cool, the board's bent, but those glue-filled kerfs are really ugly. I agree. Good thing I have some leftover veneer to cover them up. I got a rough measurement for this veneer and cut all the pieces to length with a utility knife, then prepped the insides of the draw faces to get rid of most of the glue squeeze out, and I sprayed contact adhesive on both the veneer and the inside of the draw face, and waited for that to dry and get tacky without lifting up. It's weird how you have to wait for it to dry in order to apply it, but that's just how it works. As soon as these 2 parts touch, they will be permanently bonded. So I used some dowels to prevent any unwanted adhesion and just went very slowly as I followed the curve of the draw. After it's set in place, I use pressure on a scrap to really make sure those 2 parts are stuck together for good. The veneer was oversized, so I didn't have to worry about aligning it too much when I was gluing it. So the overhangs are easily cut away with a blade, and one edge can be made perfectly smooth on the jointer, so that it could be cut to final size at the bandsaw. This seemed a lot safer than the table saw. I did, however, use the table saw to cut them to final length. The piece is held securely to a hand screw clamp, and the clamp rides along the fence, keeping the piece held upright. If I didn't have the clamp, the piece would just fall towards the blade on the curve at the end of the cut, and that would not be fun. A tenoning jig would have also really worked well here. At this point, I got those facets out of the face with a little sanding, and all the exposed plywood edges will be covered up. Another big debate for me was, what order should I be doing this? Should I cover the ends, tops, and bottoms before putting on the veneer, or was the way that I did it correct? I came to the realization that there's no correct way, there's just the way that's right for the project. For these draw faces, the corners will see the most abuse, so I wanted to make sure those were hardwood to prevent any veneer chipping or peeling situations. That's why I chose to do the veneer first. After the glue sets up on these, I cut them flush with the top and bottom and plane them flush with the fronts. Now the top and bottoms get covered up. Remember I said those bandsaw cutoffs were going to come in handy earlier? I realized they were just long and wide enough to be able to stack all the faces on it to get the edge banding from one single piece. So I roughly traced out all the draw fronts on that cutoff and attempted to cut it out at the bandsaw, but I had a wide blade in there and didn't have any smaller blades for tighter curves, so I used a jigsaw to get them to rough shape. Because this material was so thin and the pieces I were cutting were so narrow, there were some pieces that broke off, but all good, they're going to be glued down anyway, and the grain was still matching. I thought I was just going to use tape to hold this edge banding in place, but then I realized I could clamp them all at the same time using cawls at the top and bottom. This turned out really well, and I could trim up the edge banding. Now that the thin edge banding was secured, there was less of a chance it would break, so I got as close as possible to the final shape, then completed the task with a flush trim bit at the router table. As per the original design, these draw fronts will be covered with half rounds. You can buy half rounds already made at big box stores. I decided to make my own. I went with 1/2-inch rounds. So I planed the boards down to 1/2 inch thick and used a 1/4 inch round over bit on both faces of the board at the router table. Now that edge can be ripped a 1/4 inch away from the edge to make the 1/2 inch half round. I figured the safest way to cut this strip would be at the bandsaw, so that's what I did. Before proceeding with the next half round, I did a quick pass of the jointer to make a super flat edge and repeated the process. I needed a total of about 160 half rounds, but at this point I left the pieces about double in length, so this process needed to be repeated about 80 times. I felt like I had a really good flow going and moving around my shop and everything was going smoothly until my bandsaw blade snapped. Silly me, I didn't have any replacement blades that fit this bandsaw, so I had to resort to the table saw to make this cut. To make sure it was a safe process, I used a push stick that has a lip at the back that also pushes the thin cutoff past the blade. My bandsaw blade breaking was, I guess, a blessing in disguise because this process was even quicker. It took a third tool out of the equation, and I didn't have to take more than 2 steps between each pass. So cutting all 80 of these actually went by pretty quickly. The thought of sanding and finishing all 80 plus of these half rounds was not something I was looking forward to do, so I figured it would be easier and more efficient if I double side taped them to a plank all at once, and I could get around all the edges really easily with this profile sander. Even though doing it this way was pretty efficient, it was still a lot of work, and I can move on to finishing them. These half rounds will be glued to the draw faces later. In order for them to stick, I don't want finish on the back. So the double-sided tape method was killing 2 birds with 1 stone here. I did 2 coats of finish on these, then I could pop them off, cut them in half, and move on to the main part of the desk. Kind of crazy that this video is about building a desk and I haven't even started building the actual desk yet. I don't think I mentioned the wood species yet either. I'm using white oak that I got from Woodworker Source. I ordered this a while back when they were having a special on white oak and have been storing it for this project since then. Definitely always pays to check what the special is every month so you can stock up. I'll be using dominoes to keep this glue up as flat as possible, and there are a few tricks that I've learned when using it for this purpose on my previous projects. The domino is all about saving time, so I spend almost no time at all marking out the domino locations, just making sure to avoid the area that will be cut when trimming to final length. The first board gets a regular sized mortise cut on all the marks. The adjacent board will be different. The first mortise will be a regular size, just like before, but then I had the letter O marked on the rest of those that indicate these will need to be an oversized mortise and cut the rest of the mortises oversized on that board. The other edge of that board has the letter R indicated on it, so I changed the setting back to the regular setting and proceed to cut all of those. So for all the boards, one edge gets all regular size mortises, and the mating edge gets oversized mortises except the first one all the way to the left. That first row of regular mortises will ensure the boards stay in position and don't slide around too much, but leaves room for error in my haphazard markings and tool placement along the length of the boards. When gluing it up, I glue the dominoes in the mortises that are regular size. Then it's easy to get them into the mating mortises. I do this one board at a time and find it's helpful to use a quick clamp to seat all the dominoes in position before moving on to the next board. Panel clamps only have so much travel in them, so I like to make sure the pieces are really butt up against each other before tightening those down. And as you can see here, all my lazily drawn lines are matched up perfectly because the first set of mortises on each board was regular size. I hope all that made sense. Anyway, I prefer to scrape the glue while it's still wet and use a wet rag to rub away the excess, then set it off to dry. This panel was for the desk top. Then I repeated the same process for the cabinet sides, top, and bottom. The back of the cabinet on the West Elm desk is squared off. Probably because it's much easier to manufacture it that way, but I thought it would be better to make the back of the cabinet rounded to mimic the look of the front. To achieve this, I'll need thicker piece that I can make round. So I glued up a couple pieces to get a blank that I can mill down to be 3 inches square to match the radius I'll put on the desktop, and ran into a slight issue with the draw slides I was planning to use. My original plan for these back outer curves was to just cut a 45-degree cut on the inside and hoped the draw slides would fit. But then they arrived and I realized that they didn't. With the slides against the front edge of the cabinet, I marked the location where the slides would end up, and I made 2 cuts at the table saw to remove all of that material. Now the draw slide will fit perfectly. Problem solved. Those back pieces get glued to the side panels with dominoes, and I set them off to dry. These corners will get a 3-inch radius, but the largest size on the files I found earlier was 2.5 inches. So I had to jump into Fusion and design my own, and an hour later I had a perfect 3-inch radius jig. For now I used it to mark where the curve will be so I could mark a line for where to remove the waste. I set the table saw blade to 45 degrees and cut that corner off on both cabinet sides. Then I double side taped the radius jig to the top of the piece. For now, I'm just establishing the 3-inch radius, and I'll remove the rest of the material with other tools. So I remove as much material as I can with the router on all 4 corners. Just a side note, with every project I come to appreciate the different aspects of my workbench, and this vise is just amazing. In case anyone's wondering how strong it is, even though it's holding on to a small little bit of material at the end of my bench. This is a tool I don't use often, but when I do, I'm super happy I have it. I was able to roughly shape the middle section in a matter of minutes with the electric hand planer. Then once I was close to the 3-inch radius I routed on the ends, I swapped to a hand plane to make finer, more controlled cuts. This got me super close to the final shape, and I could finish the rest with some sanding. Super smooth, and this actually took way less time than I anticipated. Some final details before I can assemble the cabinet. The bottom piece will get curves cut on the corners to match the inner radius of the draw fronts, and I used the same radius jig I 3D printed earlier. But different than last time when I was using plywood, I had to be aware of grain direction, so I flipped the board to the opposite face to route the second corner to avoid tear out. I love how quick it is to use these corner jigs. Cabinet parts are ready for joinery. Quick and simple here, I chose to use dominoes. On my last project, when I used dominoes for this type of joint, I messed up big time because I forgot to change the depth setting between parts. I was using 6x40 dominoes on 3/4 inch thick material, so I had to keep changing the depth because the 20mm depth setting would have plunged through 3/4 inch material. So one of my Instagram followers suggested that I just trim the 6x40 dominoes to be 30mm long, and that way I can still have the strength of the thicker dominoes, and I could keep the dominoes set to cut 15mm deep on both parts. I forgot who suggested I do that, but if you're watching, thank you. It worked out great. Not having to remember to change the depth setting definitely made this whole process go super smoothly. No one's ever going to see the back of this cabinet, but I felt like it needed filler strips so the top and bottom were completely flush with the sides. Those filler strips and the back of the side curves also get a rabbet that will hold the cabinet back, and I can work on the drawers. I'll use undermount slides, so I got the width of the back by measuring the distance of the rails when placed in a cabinet and prepped all the parts. The back and sides are cut to their final height, and then they're cut to length using a stop block at the crosscut sled. I'm going to use 1/2-inch plywood for the draw bottom that will be set in a groove on all the parts, but it's slightly undersized, so I couldn't use a 1/2-inch bit. I used a 3/8 inch bit and ran all the pieces through the router table plus a tester piece. Once all the initial grooves were cut on all the parts, I widened the groove on the tester piece by moving the fence away from the bit in very small increments until it fit the bottom nicely, and then I made that groove the perfect size on the rest of the parts. To get the width of the bottom, I dry assembled the parts and measured from groove to groove and cut it to size. Okay, whenever I see people make drawers and they're using bloom slides, they always cut the notches for the rails after the draw box is assembled. I felt like it would be easier to do this before assembly though, so the height and width of the notch is cut using a stop block on the crosscut sled on all the parts. Then I cut off that small corner piece, creating the notch. Maybe there's a reason why people wait until they assemble the drawers to cut this notch, but I couldn't think of one. If you know of one, let me know. Honestly, I wasn't sure how to assemble these curved drawers at all, so I took a little trip to West Elm to see the piece in person to see how they did it. I noticed the front of the sides were double width, so I needed to add a little material to the front of those sides. But I'm using pre-finished plywood, so I needed to sand away the finish so the glue will stick. I made a little mistake and sanded on the wrong ends of some of them, but let's not talk about that. Glad I figured out that it was the wrong side before actually gluing on the strips though. These new thicker portions need to be shaped to match the inner curve of the draw front. So I placed the draw in the cabinet on the slides and marked the curve on the front of the sides. These sides are pretty thin, so I didn't feel safe to cut it like this on the bandsaw, so I clamped a thicker block to it to make it more stable and cut away most of the waste. I'll do a similar process as I did for the back of the cabinet. A few support pieces are placed on the side with double-sided tape. Then, to make sure the radius jig is placed in the exact same spot on all the parts creating the same length boards, I made a jig that references the back of the sides. The radius jig butts up against that jig, and I can create the perfect radius with the pattern bit. Just like before, I did this on both sides, so I just needed to clean up the waste in between. I did the bulk of the removal with the hand plane and cleaned it all up with sanding. The bottoms were only cut to width earlier. Now I can butt the front up against the sides and I can get the length. I traced the front and added a 1/4 inch because I'm going to make a groove in the front. I cut that to length, then to match the curve of the front, I used the bending form as a template. Now for the groove in the front to fit the bottom, I thought I would be able to use a slot cutting bit to match the curve of the draw with the bearing, but the groove was too high up on the board for a bit to reach. So I did it this way at the router table with a 3/8 inch bit, moving the fence to get the perfect fit. I did poke through the fronts a little bit on some of them by doing this method, but it's going to be covered up anyway, so it doesn't matter. Everything was just dry fit for now, so now it's time to assemble the drawers with glue. For now, I only assemble the back and sides to the bottom, and I really regret not using pocket holes on the back because I'm going to have to fill those screw holes. The fronts don't get glued in. They're just screwed to the sides through countersunk holes that I drilled out off camera. I debated adding glue here, but really happy that I didn't because I needed to remove one and make an adjustment later on. I used a 3D printed jig to drill the holes in the back that these undermount slides require, and I installed the slides into the cabinet. Usually you screw the front clips that attach to those draw slides to the back of the draw front, but these drawers aren't typically shaped, so I made a spacer so I could glue on blocks in the location where a normal draw front would be, and now those clips can be placed in the right location and screwed down. Always the best feeling when the draw clicks into place, and I make my way up the cabinet using spacers on top of the draw below it. These draws were actually so hard to figure out, so this moment where they all clicked in was super awesome. Now it's time to make them pretty. I transferred a center line to all the fronts and began the very long process of gluing on the half rounds I made earlier. I used a combination of wood glue and CA glue here. The wood glue will keep the pieces permanently attached to the fronts, and the CA glue just acts as a clamp while the wood glue sets up. I tried to make the pattern as random as possible, so I just placed the first one that I grabbed until the whole front was covered. I left them long so I didn't have to worry about aligning anything during the glue up process. Cutting them flush took a bit of elbow grease with a flush trim saw, but it was kind of satisfying and fun to do. Not fun? Sanding the edges on all the half rounds. With the draws finished, I could get the width of the top, so I ripped that to size at the table saw and cut it to final length using my portable MFT workbench. Cutting long, wide panels like this on the miter saw isn't really possible, and it's not so easy to do at the table saw either. This setup with the track saw rail hinge makes it super quick to get both ends squared up and cut to the right length. So happy I built this. The top will get a 3-inch radius cut on all the corners, so I trim them off with the jigsaw and then have to be aware of grain direction again. If placed on this side, there's a risk of tear out because you're going against the grain. So I flip the top over and route from the other side to always make sure I'm going with the grain. All the edges are rounded over with my trim router or at the table saw, and it's time for finish. Whenever I work with white oak, I like to use the Osmo oil in the natural color. There's a little bit of a white pigment in it to prevent the wood from yellowing. It's the same finish that I used on my daughter's bed, so it will match in her room. I do 2 coats, waiting 24 hours between each coat. While I'm finishing the top, let's talk about my new 3D printer. You guys already know how much I love the A1 and how it completely changed how I work in the shop. Well, I upgraded to the X1 Carbon and I didn't know it was possible, but now I'm even more obsessed with 3D printing. When they say it's simple and easy to use, they're not exaggerating. My 10-year-old did the assembly on this machine and we were up and running in no time. The A1 is great, but with the enclosure on the X1 Carbon, I'm able to print a wider range of filaments. And I also love the enclosed AMS. I found a file for desiccant holders that hold a moisture reader, and I'm able to keep the moisture down to 10%, which improves the quality of my prints. I've been showing you guys all the stuff I print for my woodworking, but literally every day I print something that helps me out with my regular life. Like, I wanted my pedal board to look a little neater, so I found these cable holders on MakerWorld, which cost me a half hour and 30 cents to make all 8, and now my pedal board is super tidy. I also showed you guys the swappable draw pull jig in my last video, and lots of you were interested in the file, so I'm gonna have the file available for download on my website. In case you missed that video, it's a template for integrated draw pulls that you can easily clamp to your workpiece and bench. And there's a variety of different shapes that you can swap to make all different types of draw pulls. The base has clamp slots going in multiple directions for a variety of clamping situations, and each insert locks into place using the integrated tabs. These even have a little indent on the bottom center to help you line up your workpiece so you know the cut will be exactly where you want it. If there's interest in having these available for purchase as a finished product, let me know down below. Thanks Bamboo for sponsoring this video and for giving me this creative boost in the shop. Okay, finish is dry and I could assemble it in her room. I made this base off camera that will lift the cabinet up off the floor, and it's screwed to the bottom through oversized holes to allow for wood movement. I also made this mounting plate off camera. Its ends match the radius of the top, and its bottom edge is chamfered to lighten up the look. First, I attached the legs to it using lag bolts in countersunk holes. Now the top goes on, and once in position, I can lock it down with screws through oversized holes I drilled in the top of the cabinet. Then I screw on the leg mounting plate through oversized holes as well. Back in my shop, I made a little jig to drill the holes for the draw pulls in the exact same spot on all the fronts, and I can install them into the desk. I glued the back panel into place, and I found a few draw organization inserts on MakerWorld, like this one for makeup, and I also custom made my own by going into Fusion 360 and just dividing the draw opening with a few different shaped compartments. I love being able to print all these things for her to organize all her stuff, and I love how this type of printable organization is fully customizable to fit any draw size. I'll let her decide what goes in each compartment, but I think it's cool how she can easily remove one if she needs to. These draw fronts were the most complicated thing I've done in a while, and I am super proud with how they turned out. I debated on whether or not to try to achieve a continuous grain look on all the half rounds from draw to draw, but I gave my daughter the option and she liked the random pattern better, and I think she was right. I think the randomness in the fronts definitely adds interest to the piece. I still need to fill all those screw holes and fix that little area where I sanded away on the sides, so this project is like 99% complete, but I love it, and I think I made something way better than what I could have bought at West Elm. Best part, my daughter can do her homework on it knowing that her mom put literal blood, sweat, and tears into getting it finished, and I hope it gives her motivation to work hard at whatever she puts her mind to. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Happy New Year, and I'll see you on the next one.
Wow. Thank you, Emma.
You like it?
Yeah, I love it.
Oh, what's happening here? Whoa!
That's cool.
This is what you had planned all along?
Yeah.
This is super cool. So aesthetic.